Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode number 3 of Where Eagles Dare. And again, I want to remind you, we have our logo, which is a logo of the eagle of the Secretary of Defense, the Defense Department, and the dollar bill, and also the National Security Agency. And so we always want to be combining financial markets and technology and cyber, a cyber element here. And I learned this week also that, interestingly, that the symbol, if you look, of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, guess what? The symbol of the SEC is exactly the same symbol as the Department of Defense. So let's keep that in mind. A lot of what we have in the financial system of the United States is backed by the Pentagon. And what we have in the world of cyber is a critically important element of the infrastructure that the Defense Department considers as strategic, in the strategic interest of the United States, and therefore is a national security threat when somebody else comes along and tries to imitate it, better it, create alternatives to it. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight with my wonderful dear friend, Austin Groves, who is also the co-author of our book together, which is Behind Austin's Right Shoulder. And tonight we're going to be talking about money, millennials, and 5G. And so, Austin and I were talking one day, and I was, thinking about his really fascinating career. And we said, we need to write a book about this, because as you'll discover, Austin's background is really fascinating, and he ended up catapulting himself into some of the best, of the Fortune 100 companies in the United States, and found some rather stark, surprising conclusions, especially on 5G. So Austin, we were originally talking about like an Apollo program for technology on, if we had a magic wand, what could we do to sort of catapult or reorientate or reorder the U.S. Companies that were responsible for 5G, which would be like whatever, Cisco, Verizon, AT&T, a few other companies, especially in alliance with Nokia or Ericsson. And then what we discussed in great detail was, wait a minute here, there's something much more profound going on, especially with millennials, about a social Apollo program. So talk us through, you are a millennial. You're in the classic exact mid-range of the millennial. So talk about the kinds of things that your generation is encountering socially and psychologically and professionally in the way that they are engaging with the Fortune 100.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me on, first of all. Yeah, so I've been fortunate enough to kind of work in 5G and a lot of these technology companies, both in the US and in China. And so when you and I had started kind of being in China, we realized that, how far ahead they were in technology. And so it's easier in some sense to look into, all right, why is the technology better? But then when we start getting into, okay, how did they get so far ahead, right? And part of the reason, or a big part of the reason, the driver of this is millennials, right? Because they're the ones that are developing this and implementing it, and that's kind of what I was doing in both places. And so we started doing a comparison of the millennials in China and in the US. And my background is I came from a kind of small town in upstate New York, and I noticed, and Paul, this is just something that we had talked about, that a lot of the people in my community were gravely affected by alcoholism, right, or addiction and things like that, and it became a
yeah. So Austin, talk about your high school classmates and what proportion of the ones that you were sort of a random group of your high school, what happened to them?
I mean, they're all fine human beings, and I was fortunate to take a different trajectory. I would say that 70 to 80% of them still live in my hometown, which is a fine place. But I think if you look at the conditions that we grew up with here, it was nobody was learning anything about technology or AI or 5G, and it was more of like how do we stay out of the system and just get by, right? And that tended to be the
Meaning the penal
overwhelm,
system.
the penal system, or how do I just get out of here alive, right? Because I think I can I remember very few of the people that I grew up around that weren't that didn't grow up in either a home that was an alcoholic family or an absentee household, a parent who was not there, and I think it has a big effect on the way we grow up and the way we innovate and the confidence that we have. And in addition to that, we're growing up with 9/11 and the global financial crisis and all these things happening at once. And it's kind of like you not only lose faith in the system, but we weren't in my school district. I think we had a 70% graduation rate, maybe lower, 65%. I forget. I put it in the book, and I don't know a single person in China that I've encountered that's a millennial that didn't graduate high school. I've never met one in my life, and so it's just a big difference in that regard.
And then, so talk about sort
And
of the two.
so, you know,
So Austin, there's two other things that you mentioned in the context of 9/11. We had three things that were happening. Really, you had the world of OxyContin coming in the late 90s. You had 99. You had Columbine, and you had this spate of school shootings that all of you guys grew up with. That are we going to be next? And then, of course, you had your generation that fought in Afghanistan and the Middle East and other parts of the world, coming back as sort of wounded warriors, veterans. So talk about that effect.
yeah, and remember, every one of those things that you just mentioned, China does not have, right? Whether I've never heard of a school shooting. I've never heard of I've never met a Chinese person that's been involved in an external war and came back from that. And I've never met a Chinese millennial that has been on OxyContin, right? And so all those things that you said, remember that our counterparts there, really the exposure is zero. And so, yeah, I mean, it's scary when you have to go through school shooting drills in your school. And I think, and wars that where us as millennials, we don't understand why are these happening, like what is the benefit to humanity of this conflict, right? And then you see all the soldiers coming home and God bless them for the sacrifice that they make, but a lot of us are we come home and see them with PTSD and all the other things that come along with being in an armed conflict, and we say, well, what is the purpose of this? And as I think a lot of millennials, including myself, kind of lose faith in the system of the people that are making these decisions behind closed doors or wherever they're doing it, and it actually, and so a lot of what we did in the book, as is we kind of tied this to, all right, how is this influencing the technology race between the U.S. and China, and we actually found that it has a profound influence.
And talk about that influence a little bit before we go into some of the details of your career.
So they in China, right? You have 400 million millennials, whereas there's 80 million in the U.S. And so a common misconception that I hear anecdotally about China is, they can't innovate, and they copy things and they don't work well together. And my experience there working on teams and hiring people is really the exact opposite. And we lay that out in the book. And I think that these 400 million millennials in China now are innovating at a incredibly rapid pace that the world hasn't seen for a long time, and they're making transformative technologies and whole new, whether it's digital currencies, e-commerce, logistics, everything is on your phone now in China, and you really don't need to, nobody carries a wallet anymore. It's just a totally different system from transportation, and so China has been much more embracing of kind of millennials and the technological changes that they're bringing in society, and I feel like they have a bigger voice to do that, and to take risks and things like that. Whereas in the U.S., it's still this corporate system run by these another one is college debt, right? So you get a lot of millennials that have to take jobs just so they can keep up with their debt payments of $600 a month, right, with very little disposable income afterwards due to the high cost of living and things like that. And they get put in these, it's similar to me, like, you get put in a big company where you really don't have a voice, and it's being run by these, people with huge egos that are really just kind of sitting on the bus waiting to retire, right? They're 50, 55 years old. And so they are much more interested in using whatever capital they have for share buybacks and dividends, rather than investing that in people and innovation and things like that. And so you have like a mix of all these things combined. And then, the millennials that are in these organizations, right, they just feel like totally cheated, and it's from the time of Columbine, 9/11, the wars, addiction, and you have these people coming into these organizations, and they say, man, I am fed up with this system that I'm supposed to be following, right?
And so what do you say to somebody who's 50, 55, 60, who says, oh, you millennials, you're spoiled, rotten, entitled, snotty whiners? What do you say to that?
Well, I would say that they've had to deal with a lot, right? And I'm not. Yeah, I know that they had to deal with Vietnam and the civil rights movement and things like that. But I think if you look at the rate just of opioid addiction now compared to then, it's far higher, right? And the percentage of adolescents growing up in homes with absentee parents and things like that, it plays a very large role, right? And in addition to that, at that time there wasn't as much competition as we have now in the global economy, right? And I've worked in something like 40 countries. I've been really fortunate, and now we have 6 billion people, 7 billion people that are trying to eat our lunch, us being the US, right? And so it's something that we haven't had it like this before, because the world is just so connected now, whether we like it or not. And so it plays a much bigger difference now on how we handle these things.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And so let's go to some of the individual examples of how you sort of were, because I've been talking to you over the years, and I've watched you sort of duck and dive through sort of fascinating but also extremely frustrating professional experiences. And so let's talk about your experience with Accenture when you were in Atlanta. So run us through sort of how you got this amazing job, and then sort of run us through how you were accepted, or how they chose to deal or not deal with you as a millennial.
So I would say Accenture is definitely one of the better ones that I've encountered. I came onto Accenture because they were a partner. I was at a smaller Chinese company that we were developing an IoT device for Coca-Cola coolers, right? It was at the time, nobody was doing this, right? We had the first device ever that could put a a camera inside a cooler, and it also had a temperature gauge and could measure the door openings and connect with people's mobile phones. So Coca-Cola, who typically they put their coolers in 7-Elevens and things like that, and they have no control over this device, right? Now this IoT device gave them an opportunity to have a direct kind of interaction with their consumers in the 15 million outlets that they have, which was a big advantage. And so I was kind of involved from the beginning in the development of this device and the software and the platforms that we kind of deployed it on. And so we ended up getting an opportunity to bid on a contract for a very large Coca-Cola entity. And we brought Accenture in as our partner. And so after doing this deal, Accenture actually kind of recruited me over to lead their kind of IoT deployments in this area for consumer goods companies. So, the good thing that I had was I came in with a specialty already. And so I was, and I could also speak Chinese. So I was the IoT guy that could speak Chinese in Accenture. And so everyone in the digital group in Accenture pretty much knew that was what I was doing. And so we got on a high profile project early on. And so the way it works is when you have a new, because at this time, really, they were just, all the consulting companies, they just had PowerPoints about IoT, right? They weren't really, to be honest, they were not doing anything substantial yet. And this was like, I think, 2014, 15, right? And so, and so I was fortunate that I came in with a specialty, or two specialties, I guess. And so I became the guy in Accenture that got to go, because I spoke Chinese, so I was more likely to get put on international assignments, and IoT was the area that they were dying to really get really good case studies with kind of like brand name clients to promote themselves. So,
and so you were in Indochina and all over the earth, in these dozens of countries. Talk about a second about, in the book, it's really important that as 5G has, really only been, pushed out toward the end of last year, and the book was published only this year. Talk about how the IoT is sort of the precursor to 5G.
Okay, so in my, I guess in our opinion, in the book, we state this is that we do not believe that 5G is going to make a huge impact in daily consumer lives in our mobile phone, right? I can already stream content as fast as I need to. Most of it I watch in my home now that with coronavirus, so I don't have personally, I would not pay more for a faster service on my phone right now with my current daily life. But where you start to really see the benefit of 5G is actually in the various connected devices around a given city, right? Because it's most likely going to be deployed in the cities first, whether it's, self-driving cars or, all these, delivery drones and things like that, right? And so IoT is basically, right, it's devices that are collecting information and now gradually even becoming smarter to make their own decisions. So as these devices, robots are going to need to be making intelligent decisions on the edge, or at the edge, we call it, right? So at the actual device level, right? That's when you're going to start to need a 5G type of system in order to be able to rapidly make important decisions.
So like in logistics, in digital coin, in smart cities, in traffic and autonomous vehicles and so forth. And so if you don't have this IoT infrastructure, it's very hard to monetize 5G. That this is kind of the point we make, right?
Exactly. You have to have devices deployed and the platforms to connect them, and then the bandwidth, right?
Yeah, and then I was talking to you when you were in Mexico City, and I was just cracking up because you were in Mexico City doing some work with AT&T, and then you were saying, Paul, there's a lot of people speaking Chinese here. And I was like, what? And so I always tell people, Sabrina Mang, when she was arrested in Vancouver, she was on her way to Mexico City to do work with Huawei. And I think, the United States, when they learned about all this, was very nervous about, this Monroe Doctrine of protecting the Western Hemisphere, right, for the U.S. only. And what did you see there, and did it bother you? And what was AT&T doing with Huawei at the time?
Well, they had an entire apartment building right next to our office that Huawei leased just to house all the Chinese people that were there building out their network. And they were doing a great job, right? So we had, I was deployed from. I was deployed to AT&T. They had bought the third and fourth largest telecom provider in Mexico, and I was charged with leading their IoT deployment and integration between the three companies. And so basically they needed to start rolling out IoT products and services like connected cars and connected devices, things like that, right? And so I kind of put together the infrastructure for that program. And so we're building out the network core and things like that. And really, so in the offices of AT&T, right, you have Accenture, you have Ericsson, HP, Nokia, all these guys, and they're all trying to get little pieces of business, but really the backbone of what everything was built on, and by far the largest number of people there were Chinese, and they were from Huawei building out the whole network. And they did it faster and cheaper than all these other people combined.
Yeah, right. Have you heard about what's happened? Anything?
So, we write a lot about this in the book, is that the telecoms we don't believe are the most, the U.S. is relying on these telecoms to take them into 5G, and they're just stumbling over themselves constantly, right? And so I was there 5 years ago, maybe, and they've just now successfully deployed IoT products and services in Mexico. That's what I hear.
And 5G is still not there.
No. They were building out 4G at the time.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. And then so you went from Accenture. Now talk about your time with Verizon and their build out of IoT and their sort of quest toward 5G, because you were at Verizon as well.
Yeah. So the what I realized is that, like I said, the telecom companies were kind of stubborn. So the telecoms, they just missed the boat on software, and so they had, in the beginning, right, Verizon and AT&T were able to have a monopoly because they bought all the spectrum from the government, and so that allowed them to have a monopoly. They bought up all the competitors, and it was like, they had nothing to worry about, right? But then once mobile handsets in the US kind of reached full capacity, there was no more. They said, okay, well, we have to try to grow this thing. And so they attempted to do that with, data connections. And so, when I was on Accenture, we basically looked at the telecoms as like, all right, doesn't matter. Whoever gives you the cheapest deal, we just go with them because it's all the same. We only need them for a data connection, right? And so, they eventually, 5 years later, they had a wake-up call, and they said, hey, we need to have actual solutions to customers instead of just providing the data connection for someone else's solution, because the real money is in the software, right? Is in the actual being able to provide value to the end user. And so when I was at Verizon, I was one of the first employees onboarded to kind of take that program live. And so what they had spent 2 to 3 years paying outside firms to help them develop these IoT applications, like end-to-end application, we call it. So from the device, the hardware, to the actual end user software, whether it's an app or whatever, and they just didn't work. And so we had a really tough time kind of getting started and scaling the program, because they didn't have that background in making applications that were useful to consumers.
How many did they hire in within 6 month period?
It was 2 to 3 months. They hired 200 people making significant money. So they pulled this program out of nowhere. It was like someone in the C-suite was like, we got to be on this IoT thing, and they were just pulling people in. I think I had one interview, and I was hired.
And how many of those people were left 2 years later?
They disbanded the program now. Yeah, actually, after I was there for like a year and a half, maybe, and a month after I left, I decided to go on back to China. A month after I left, they disbanded the whole. After they do these reorgs. So when I was there for 3 reorgs where they moved us around and changed our name, and now the program is officially disbanded.
So there was a reorg every 6 months, basically.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's what they do. But one of our team boss, he retired early, and then or they switched them to HR or whatever, right? So they have a creative way of trying to not admit that they failed to the board.
Yeah, and so that's when I remember talking to you, and you were like, "Okay, this is it. I've tried this 3 different times. This is a catastrophe. Get me out of here. I'm going to go to China." And you went to China and you started up a very successful company that was doing e-commerce on high-end products. And so one of the things that you talk about in the book, I want to talk about 3 quick issues. One of them is something that was interesting that you had encountered with the staff. You hired about 40 staff. Is that correct?
30, yeah.
30, yeah. And so your experience in hiring and managing these people over several years, what is this like myth of the one-child policy, and how did you see it playing out in your office?
Yeah, sure. So, at this time I hadn't been really working in China full time for around 6 years at this point. And so from 2013 to 17, or 2012 to 2017, I couldn't believe how big the change was. So let me start off by saying that, I was just coming out of Mexico City. And so I was like not really looking forward to go into like a quote unquote developing country. And then I got back to China and I realized, man, this is like going to the future, in 2017 at the time. And so I arrived in Shanghai, and I had an opportunity to build an e-commerce company, and we were importing premium products from overseas, and we were selling them on Tmall and different platforms. And so we had some early success, and I had to scale really fast. And I had the experience where I had to hire something like 15 or 20 people to either run the operations with logistics or do e-commerce marketing and things like that in a very kind of short period of time. And yeah, my partner and I were really pleasantly surprised with the amount of talent that we found just right in downtown Shanghai. And so we hired a team of highly qualified data analytics people, marketing people, logistics, and the monthly cost of our overhead was like what it would cost to hire maybe 2 or 3 people in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, fascinating. And then as we carry on further into 2019 and this kind of this tech Cold War, it got started. You made an interesting analogy, and we talk about all of this in the book. You made the interesting analogy that the way that you see the U.S. treating China is the way that Uber had ganged up on the taxi companies that were trying to undermine Uber. So talk about that.
So I think the comparison it's identical, actually. And so you have in the case with Uber or Tesla, when they came out with a technology and a service that was absolutely transformative, and their competitors didn't know what to do about it, right? And so what did they do? What did the taxi companies do to Uber, whether it was in Atlanta, Michigan, London, right? They said that what you're doing is unsafe and it's illegal, and And, I don't know about you, but me personally, I've never had a bad experience in an Uber, whereas I don't think I could count the bad experiences I've had in taxis on both of my hands, right? And so, right now we have a very obvious, clear situation of the US doing the same thing to China, which is basically kneecapping them. And I'm not saying I don't have an opinion on whether good or bad, and I'm not, criticizing anyone, but it's definitely what the strategy that the US has decided to take rather than doing what we talk about in the book, just these two Apollo programs to just get back out in front and compete.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Now, let's go, as we conclude, I want to ask a couple of things. I know you very well. I know your family, and so, you came from a family where there was a great deal of alcoholism. In some ways, you're like that book, Hillbilly Elegy, right? And that was a bestseller. And so I would say you are an example of something which may not be a bug in American culture, but a feature where there is a much more widely stated problem of addiction, alcohol, opioids, and so forth. How did you escape from it? And what is resilience to you? And how do millennials stay on track with, what you and I both know from people that we know and are friends with, where there's a great deal of anxiety and distraction and for some, inability to focus. And how have you stayed on track? What's the key to resilience in your opinion?
Yeah, I want to start out by saying first, I'm very lucky. I'm very fortunate because many people didn't. I have a lot of friends that didn't make it, quite honestly. And I found that finding a group of like-minded people that share similar experiences is the best solution in my mind. And yeah, I do agree that this is 100% a feature. Whereas in places like China, you have like a family support system. The grandparents live with the kid. Sometimes both sets of grandparents in the house, so you have, and it's only a single child, right? So you have, 4 people supporting this child from birth until they get into university, where they're not going to be saddled with debt and things like that. And in the US, in my immediate group of friends, we just didn't have that. Like 3 of my best friends' fathers were dead by the time we were, like, I think 15, right?
Drug addiction?
Yeah. And that played a significant role in all of them, and so, yeah, you got to find people that are, have similar experiences and stick together. That's my experience.
So you got to find a posse.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, and then
it's out there.
Go ahead, sorry.
And it's out there, and I found that, like, no matter how bad of a situation that I was in, kind of growing up, there were always people that were willing to help me. And if you seek it, it's definitely out there, right? The system in the U.S. for helping these people could obviously be improved, but there's still so many good people out there that are available and willing to help.
Yeah. And now let's round off and conclude on a positive note and the hope. What do you see as the hope in the U.S. saying, okay, we're not going to kick the kneecaps of our competitor, we're going to compete? So what's the deal on maybe a different administration? I don't know, on sort of pulling it out and maybe getting more private public agreement on 5G, or what's the way out? I know we talk about a lot of this in the book as solutions. And is this kneecapping of China going to stop?
No, it's not going to stop. And you would need a different administration to do it. It's just not going to happen under the current administration. And, especially in the past 1 week, right? When the book came out, it was a totally different situation with the coronavirus. But now, with how bad this has gotten in the past week, 2 weeks, the coronavirus situation in the US, someone has got to be blamed for this, right? And I don't imagine that anyone in Washington is going to be taking the blame themselves. So who is the one that they're going to blame, right? It's going to be China. And so, I do not, at the time the book came out, if you asked me this, I would say, maybe there's some hope that this is rhetoric and not as real, but I don't see, I wish we could end it on a more positive note, but I do not see U.S.-China relations getting any better. And I would say the kneecapping there is going all in right now. You do start to see some kind of evidence in the U.S. is, I mean, I think, and you talk a lot about this as well, Paul, that they are doing something that looks like a shell of kind of what we suggested for an Apollo program on the technology side, where I think Pentagon's getting involved in more things regarding to AI and 5G. But, largely the U.S. is still relying on bloated, inefficient, short-term, shareholder-focused telecom companies to bring them into the age of 5G. And it's just not going to happen as fast as what China's doing, where it's like an all-in government, business, together develop this at all costs. It's just a totally different mindset toward it. And the social issues, we've seen that this is actually starting to get worse since the pandemic, right? In terms of opioid usage and things like that.
No, this is fascinating. We'll do this again. Austin, thank you so much for your time. This is great. We'll do this again because there's so much more to cover. And you're
thank you so much for having me.
A great interlocutor.
And
buy the book, for God's sake. Right, Austin?
Yeah, buy our book. It's on Amazon, The Race for 5G Supremacy.
All right, good.